but not the profit. Having revolved these things in his mind, and arrived at this conclusion, he communicated to Mr Swiveller as much of his meditations as he thought proper. Dick would have been perfectly satisfied with less, and giving him the day to recover himself from his late salamandering, accompanied him at evening to Mr Quilp's house. Mighty glad Mr Quilp was to see them, or mightily glad he seemed to be, and fearfully polite Mr Quilp was to Mrs Quilp and Mrs Jiniwin, and very sharp was the look he cast on his wife to observe how she was affected by the recognition of young Trent. Mrs Quilp was as innocent as her own mother of any emotion, painful or pleasant, which the sight of him awakened, but as her husband's glance made her timid and confused and uncertain what to do or what was required of her, Mr Quilp did not fail to assign her embarrassment to the cause he had in his mind, and while he chuckled at his penetration, was secretly exasperated by his jealousy. Nothing of this appeared, however. On the contrary, Mr Quilp was all blandness and suavity, and presided over the case bottle of rum with extraordinary open-heartedness.
'Why, let me see,' said Quilp. 'It must be a matter of nearly 2 years since we were first acquainted.'
'Nearer 3, I think,' said Trent.
'Nearer 3!' cried Quilp. 'How fast time flies! Does it seem as long as that to you, Mrs Quilp?'
'Yes, I think it seems full 3 years, Quilp,'
was the unfortunate reply. 'Oh, indeed, ma'am,' thought Quilp. 'You have been pining, have you? Very good, ma'am.'
'It seems to me but yesterday that you went out to Demerara in the Mary Ann,' said Quilp. 'But yesterday, I declare. Well, I like a little wildness. I was wild myself once.'
Mr Quilp accompanied this admission with such an awful wink, indicative of old rovings and backslidings, that Mrs Jiniwin was indignant, and could not forbear from remarking under her breath that he might at least put off his confessions until his wife was absent, for which act of boldness and insubordination Mr Quilp first stared her out of countenance, and then drank her health ceremoniously.
'I thought you'd come back directly, Fred. I always thought that,' said Quilp, setting down his glass. 'And when the Mary Ann returned with you on board, instead of a letter to say what a contrite heart you had, and how happy you were in the situation that had been provided for you, I was amused, exceedingly amused.'
The young man smiled, but not as though the theme was the most agreeable one that could have been selected for his entertainment, and for that reason Quilp pursued it.
'I always will say,' he resumed, 'that when a rich relation having 2 young people, sisters or brothers, or brother and sister, dependent on him, attaches himself exclusively to one, and casts off the other, he does wrong.' The young man made a movement of impatience, but Quilp went on as calmly as if he were discussing some abstract question in which nobody present had the slightest personal interest. 'It's very true,' said Quilp, 'that your grandfather urged repeated forgiveness, ingratitude, riot, and extravagance, and all that. But as I told him, these are common faults. But he's a scoundrel, said he. Granting that, said I, for the sake of argument of course, a great many young noblemen and gentlemen are scoundrels too. But he wouldn't be convinced.
'I wonder at that, Mr Quilp,' said the young man, sarcastically.
'Well, so did I at the time,' returned Quilp, 'but he was always obstinate. He was in a manner a friend of mine, but he was always obstinate and wrong-headed. Little Nell is a nice girl, a charming girl, but you're her brother, Frederick. You're her brother, after all. As you told him the last time you met, he can't alter that.'
'He would if he could, confound him for that and all other kindnesses,' said the young man impatiently. 'But nothing can come of this subject now, and let us have done with it in the devil's name.'
'Agreed,' returned Quilp. 'Agreed on my part readily. Why have I alluded to it? Just to show you, Frederick, that I have always stood your friend, You little knew who was your friend and who your foe, now did you? You thought I was against you, and so there has been a coolness between us. But it was all on your side, entirely on your side. Let's shake hands again, Fred.'
With his head sunk down between his shoulders, and a hideous grin overspreading his face, the dwarf stood up and stretched his short arm across the table. After a moment's hesitation, the young man stretched out his to meet it. Quilp clutched his fingers in a grip that for the moment stopped the current of the blood within them, and pressing his other hand upon his lip and frowning towards the unsuspicious Richard, released them and sat down. This action was not lost upon Trent, who, knowing that Richard Swiveller was a mere tool in his hands, and knew no more of his designs than he thought proper to communicate, saw that the dwarf perfectly understood their relative position, and fully entered into the character of his friend. It is something to be appreciated, even in knavery. This silent homage to his superior abilities, no less than a sense of the power with which the dwarf's quick perception had already invested him, inclined the young man towards that ugly worthy, and determined him to profit by his aid. It being now Mr Quilp's cue to change the subject with all convenient expedition, lest Richard Swiveller, in his heedlessness, should reveal anything which it was inexpedient for the women to know, he proposed a game at four-handed cribbage, and partners being cut for, Mrs Quilp fell to Frederick Trent, and Dick himself to Quilp. Mrs Jiniwin, being very fond of cards, was carefully excluded by her son-in-law from any participation in the game, and had assigned her to the duty of occasionally replenishing the glasses from the case bottle. Mr Quilp from that moment keeping one eye constantly upon her, lest she should by any means procure a taste of the same, and thereby tantalizing the wretched old lady, who was as much attached to the case bottle as the cards, in a double degree and most ingenious manner. But it was not to Mrs Jiniwin alone that Mr Quilp's attention was restricted, as several other matters required his constant vigilance. Among his various eccentric habits he had a humorous one of always cheating at cards, which rendered necessary on his part not only a close observance of the game and a sleight of hand in counting and scoring, but also involved the constant correction, by looks and frowns and kicks under the table, of Richard Swiveller, who, being bewildered by the rapidity with which his cards were told, and the rate at which the pegs travelled down the board, could not be prevented from sometimes expressing his surprise and incredulity. Mrs Quilp, too, was the partner of young Trent, and for every look that passed between them, at every word they spoke, and every card they played, the dwarf had eyes and ears, not occupied alone with what was passing above the table, but with signals that might be exchanging beneath it, which he laid all kinds of traps to detect, besides often treading on his wife's toes to see whether she cried out or remained silent under the infliction, in which latter case it would have been quite clear that Trent had been treading on her toes before. Yet, in the most of all these distractions, the one eye was upon the old lady always, and if she so much as stealthily advanced a teaspoon towards a neighbouring glass, which she often did, for the purpose of abstracting but one sup of its sweet contents, Quilp's hand would overset it in the very moment of her triumph, and Quilp's mocking voice implore her to regard her precious health. And in any one of these his many cares, from first to last, Quilp never flagged nor faltered. At length, when they had played a great many rubbers, and drawn pretty freely upon the case bottle, Mr Quilp warned his lady to retire to rest, and that submissive wife complying, and being followed by her indignant mother, Mr Swiveller fell asleep. The dwarf, beckoning his remaining companion to the other end of the room, held a short conference with him in whispers.
'It's as well not to say more than one can help before our worthy friend,' said Quilp, making a grimace towards the slumbering Dick. 'Is it a bargain between us, Fred? Shall he marry little Rosy Nell by and by?'
'You have some end of your own to answer, of course,' returned the other.
'Of course I have, dear Fred,'
said Quilp, grinning to think how little he suspected what the real end was.
'It's retaliation, perhaps whim. I have influence, Fred, to help or oppose. Which way shall I use it? There are a pair